The Cybrarian presents Robert E. Howard's Conan, Beyond the Black River. Disclaimer. The following may contain violence, references to sex, and language that may offend. Part 3, Chapter 4, The Beasts of Zogar Sag. Fires dazzled Balthus again as he slowly recovered his senses. He blinked, shook his head. Their glare hurt his eyes. A confused medley of sound rose about him, growing more distinct as his senses cleared. He lifted his head and stared stupidly about him. Black figures hemmed him in, etched against crimson tongues of flame. Memory and understanding came in a rush. He was bound upright to a post in an open space, ringed by fierce and terrible figures. Beyond that ring, fires burned, tended by naked, dark-skinned women. Beyond the fires he saw huts of mud and wattle, thatched with brush. Beyond the huts there was a stockade with a broad gate. But he saw these things only incidentally. Even the cryptic dark women with their curious coiffures were noted by him only absently. His full attention was fixed in awful fascination on the men who stood glaring at him. Short men, broad-shouldered, deep-chested, lean-hipped. They were naked except for scanty loincloths. The firelight brought out the play of their swelling muscles in bold relief. Their dark faces were immobile, but their narrow eyes glittered with the fire that burns in the eyes of a stalking tiger. Their tangled manes were bound back with bands of copper. Swords and axes were in their hands. Crude bandages banded the limbs of some men, and smears of blood were dried on their dark skins. There had been fighting, recent and deadly. His eyes wavered away from the steady glare of his captors, and he repressed a cry of horror. A few feet away there rose a low, hideous pyramid. It was built of gory human heads. Dead eyes glared glassily up the black sky. Numbly, he recognized the countenances which were turned towards him. They were the heads of the men who had followed Conan into the forest. He could not tell if the Cimmerian's head were among them. Only a few faces were visible to him. It looked to him as if there must be 10 or 11 heads at least. A deadly sickness assailed him. He fought a desire to retch. Beyond the heads lay the bodies of half a dozen Picts. He was aware of a fierce exultation at the sight. The forest runners had taken toll, at least. Twisting his head away from the ghastly spectacle, he became aware that another post stood near him. A stake painted black, as was the one to which he was bound. A man sagged in his bonds there, naked except for his leather breeks, whom Balthus recognized as one of Conan's woodsmen. Blood trickled from his mouth and oozed sluggishly from a gash in his side. Lifting his head as he licked his livid lips, he muttered, making himself heard with difficulty above the fiendish clamour of the Picts.
So, they got you too. Sneaked up in the water and cut the other fellow's throat,
groaned Balthus.
We never heard them till they were on us. Mitra, how can anything move so silently?
The devils, mumbled the frontiersman.
They must have been watching us from the time we left midstream. We walked into a trap. Arrows from all sides were ripping into us before we knew it. Most of us dropped at the first fire. 3 or 4 broke through the bushes and came to hand grips. But there were too many. Conan might have gotten away. I haven't seen his head. Been better for you and me if they'd have killed us outright. I can't blame Conan. Ordinarily, we'd have gotten to the village without being discovered. They don't keep spies on the riverbank as far down as we landed. We must have stumbled into a big party coming up the river from the south. Some devilment is up. Too many Picts here. These aren't all Gawali. Men from the western tribes here and from up and down the river.
Balthus stared at the ferocious shapes. Little as he knew of Pictish ways, he was aware that the number of men clustered about them was out of proportion to the size of the village. There were not enough huts to have accommodated them all. Then he noticed that there was a difference in the barbaric tribal designs painted on their faces and breasts.
Some kind of devilment,
muttered the forest runner.
They might have gathered here to watch Zorgar's magic making. He'll make some rare magic with our carcasses. Well, a border man doesn't expect to die in bed. But I wish we'd gone out along with the rest.
The wolfish howling of the Picts rose in volume and exultation, and from a movement in their ranks, an eager surging and crowding, Balthus deducted that someone of importance was coming. Twisting his head about, he saw that the stakes were set before a long building, larger than the other huts, decorated by human skulls dangling from the eaves. Through the door of that structure now danced a fantastic figure.
Zorgar,
muttered the woodsman, his bloody countenance set in wolfish lines as he unconsciously strained at his cords. Balthus saw a lean figure of middle height, almost hidden in ostrich plumes set on a harness of leather and copper. From amidst the plumes peered a hideous and malevolent face. The plumes puzzled Balthus. He knew their source lay half the width of the world to the south. They fluttered and rustled evilly as the shaman leapt and cavorted. With fantastic bounds and prancing, he entered the ring and whirled before his bound and silent captives. With another man, it would have seemed ridiculous. A foolish, savage, prancing meaninglessness in a whirl of feathers. But that ferocious face glaring out from the billowing mass gave the scene a grim significance. No man with a face like that could seem ridiculous or like anything except the devil he was. Suddenly, he froze to statuesque stillness. The plumes rippled once and sank about him. The howling warriors fell silent. Zorgar Sag stood erect and motionless, and he seemed to increase in height, to grow and expand. Balthus experienced the illusion that the Pict was towering above him, staring contemptuously down from a great height, though he knew the shaman was not as tall as himself. He shook off the illusion with difficulty. The shaman was talking now, a harsh, guttural intonation that yet carried the hiss of a cobra. He thrust his head on his long neck towards the wounded man on the stake. His eyes shone red as blood in the firelight. The frontiersman spat full in his face. With a fiendish howl, Zorgar bounded convulsively into the air, and the warriors gave tongue to a yell that shuddered up to the stars. They rushed towards the man on the stake, but the shaman beat them back. A snarled command sent men running to the gate. They hurled it open, turned and raced back to the circle. The ring of men split, divided with desperate haste to right and left. Balthus saw the women and naked children scurrying to the huts. They peeked out of doors and windows. A broad lane was left to the open gate, beyond which loomed the black forest, crowding suddenly in upon the clearing, unlighted by the fires. A tense silence regained as Zogar Sag turned towards the forest, raised on his tiptoes and sent a weird, inhuman call, shuddering out into the night. Somewhere, far out in the black forest, a deeper cry answered him. Balthus shuddered. From the timbre of that cry, he knew it never came from a human throat. He remembered what Valanis had said, that Zogar boasted that he could summon wild beasts to do his bidding. The woodsman was livid beneath his mask of blood. He licked his lips spasmodically. The village held its breath. Zogar Sag stood still as a statue, his plumes trembling faintly about him. But suddenly, the gate was no longer empty. A shuddering gasp swept over the village and men crowded hastily back, jamming one another between the huts. Balthus felt the short hair stir on his scalp. The creature that stood in the gate was like the embodiment of nightmare legend. Its colour was of a curious, pale quality which made it seem ghostly and unreal by the dim light. But there was nothing unreal about the low-hung savage head and the great curved fangs that glistened in the firelight. On noiseless, padded feet, it approached like a phantom out of the past. It was a survivor of an older, grimmer age, the ogre of many an ancient legend, a saber-toothed tiger. No Hyborian hunter had looked upon one of those primordial brutes for centuries. Immemorial myths lent the creatures a supernatural quality, induced by their ghostly colour and their fiendish ferocity. The beast that glided toward the men on the stakes was longer and heavier than a common striped tiger, almost as bulky as a bear. Its shoulders and forelegs were so massive and mightily muscled as to give it a curiously top-heavy look, though its hindquarters were more powerful than that of a lion. Its jaws were massive, but its head was brutishly shaped. Its brain capacity was small. It had room for no instincts except those of destruction. It was a freak of carnivorous development, evolution run amok in a horror of fangs and talons. This was the monstrosity Zogar Sag had summoned out of the forest. Balthus no longer doubted the actuality of the shaman's magic. Only the black arts could establish a domination over that tiny-brained, mighty-thewed monster. Like a whisper at the back of his consciousness rose the vague memory of the name of an ancient god of darkness and primordial fear, to whom once both men and beasts bowed and whose children, men whispered, still lurked in dark corners of the world. New horror tinged the glare he fixed on Zogar Sag. The monster moved past the heap of bodies and the pile of gory heads without appearing to notice them. He was no scavenger. He hunted only the living, in a life dedicated solely to slaughter. An awful hunger burned greenly in the wide, unwinking eyes, the hunger not alone of belly emptiness, but the lust of death-dealing. His gaping jaws slavered. The shaman stepped back. His hand waved towards the woodsman. The great cat sank into a crouch, and Balthus numbly remembered tales of its appalling ferocity, of how it would spring upon an elephant and drive its sword-like fangs so deeply into the titan's skull that they could never be withdrawn, but would keep it nailed to its victim, to die by starvation. The shaman cried out shrilly, and with an ear-shattering roar, the monster sprang. Balthus had never dreamed of such a spring, such a hurtling of incarnated destruction embodied in that giant bulk of iron thews and rippling talons. Full on the woodsman's breast it struck, and the stake splintered and snapped at the base, crashing to the earth under the impact. The saber-tooth was gliding toward the gate, half dragging, half carrying a hideous crimson hulk that only faintly resembled a man. Balthus glared, almost paralysed, his brain refusing to credit what his eyes had seen. In that leap, the great beast had not only broken off the stake, it had ripped the mangled body of its victim from the post to which it was bound. The huge talons in that instant of contact had disemboweled and partly dismembered the man, and the giant fangs had torn away the whole top of his head, shearing through the skull as easily as through flesh. Stout rawhide thongs had given way like paper. Where the thongs had held, flesh and bones had not. Balthus retched suddenly. He had hunted bears and panthers, but he had never dreamed the beast lived which could make such a red ruin of a human frame in the flicker of an instant. The saber-tooth vanished through the gate, and a few moments later a deep roar sounded through the forest, receding in the distance. But the Picts still shrank back against the huts, and the shaman still stood facing the gate that was like the black opening to let in the night. Cold sweat burst suddenly out on Balthus's skin. What new horror would come through that gate to make carrion meat of his body? Sick panic assailed him, and he strained futilely at his thongs. The night pressed in, very black and horrible outside the firelight. The fires themselves glowed lurid as the fires of hell. He felt the eyes of the Picts upon him. Hundreds of hungry, cruel eyes that reflected the lust of souls utterly without humanity as he knew it. They no longer seemed men. They were devils of this black jungle, as inhuman as the creatures to which the fiend in the nodding plumes screamed through the darkness.
Gosh! Yes.
Zogar sent another call, shuddering through the night, and it was utterly unlike the first cry. There was a hideous sibilance in it. Balthus turned cold at the implication. If a serpent could hiss that loud, it would make just such a sound. This time, there was no answer. Only a period of breathless silence in which the pound of Balthus's heart strangled him. And then there sounded a swishing outside the gate, a dry rustling that sent chills down Balthus's spine. Again, the firelit gate held a hideous occupant. Again, Balthus recognized the monster from ancient legends. He saw and knew the ancient and evil serpent which swayed there, its wedge-shaped head huge as that of a horse, as high as a tall man's head, and its palely gleaming barrel rippling out behind it. A forked tongue darted in and out, and the firelight glittered on its bared fangs. Balthus became incapable of emotion. The horror of his fate paralysed him. That was the reptile that the ancients called ghost snake. The pale, abominable terror that of old glided into huts by night to devour whole families. Like the python, it crushed its victim, but unlike other constrictors, its fangs bore venom that carried madness and death. It too had long been considered extinct, but Valanus had spoken truly. No white man knew what shapes haunted the great forests beyond Black River. It came on silently, rippling over the ground, its hideous head on the same level, its neck curving back slightly for the stroke. Balthus gazed with a glazed, hypnotized stare into the loathsome gullet down which he would soon be engulfed, and he was aware of no sensation except a vague nausea. And then something that glinted in the firelight streaked from the shadows of the huts. And the great reptile whipped about and went into instant convulsions. As in a dream, Balthus saw a short throwing spear transfixing the mighty neck. Just below the gaping jaws, the shaft protruded from one side, the steel head from the other. Knotting and looping hideously, the maddened reptile rolled into the circle of men who stove back from it. The spear had not severed its spine, but merely transfixed its great neck muscles. Its furiously lashing tail mowed down a dozen men, and its jaws snapped convulsively, splashing others with venom that burned like liquid fire. Howling, cursing, screaming, frantic, they scattered before it, knocking each other down in their flight, trampling the fallen, bursting through the huts. The giant snake rolled into a fire, scattering sparks and brands, and the pain lashed it to more frenzied efforts. A hut wall buckled under the ram-like impact of its flailing tail, disgorging howling people. Men stampeded through the fires, knocking the logs right and left. The flames sprang up, then sank. The reddish, dim glow was all that lighted that nightmare scene where the giant reptile whipped and rolled, and men clawed and shrieked in frantic flight. Balthus felt something jerk at his wrists, and then, miraculously, he was free, and a strong hand dragged him behind the post. Dazedly, he saw Conan, felt the forest man's iron grip on his arm. There was blood on the Cybrarian's mail, dried blood on the sword in his right hand. He loomed, dim and gigantic in the shadowy light.
Come on, before they get over their panic.
Balthus felt the haft of an axe shoved into his hand. Zogar Sag had disappeared. Conan dragged Balthus after him until the youth's numb brain awoke, and his legs began to move of their own accord. Then Conan released him and ran into the building where the skulls hung. Balthus followed him. He got a glimpse of a grim stone altar, faintly lighted by the glow outside. 5 human heads grinned on that altar, and there was a grisly familiarity about the features of the freshest. It was the head of the merchant, Tiberius. Behind the altar was an idol, dim, indistinct, bestial, yet vaguely manlike in outline. Then fresh horror choked Balthus as the shape heaved up suddenly with a rattle of chains, lifting long, misshapen arms in the gloom. Conan's sword flailed down, crunching through flesh and bone, and then the Cybrarian was dragging Balthus around the altar, past a huddled, shaggy bulk on the floor, to a door at the back of the long hut. Through this they burst, out into the enclosure again, but a few yards beyond them loomed the stockade. It was dark behind the altar hut. The mad stampede of the Picts had not carried them in that direction. At the wall Conan halted, gripped Balthus, and heaved him at arm's length into the air as he might have lifted a child. Balthus grasped the points of the upright logs set in the sun-dried mud and scrambled up on them, ignoring the havoc upon his skin. He lowered a hand to the Cybrarian, when around the corner of the altar hut sprang a fleeing Pict. He halted short, glimpsing the man on the wall in the faint glow of the fires. Conan hurled his axe with deadly aim, but the warrior's mouth was already open for a yell of warning, and it rang, loud above the din, cut short as he dropped with a shattered skull. Blinding terror had not submerged all ingrained instincts. As that wild yell rose above the clamour, there was an instant's lull, and then 100 throats bayed ferocious answer, and warriors came leaping to repel the attack presaged by the warning. Conan leapt high, caught not Balthus's hand, but his arm near the shoulder, and swung himself up. Balthus set his teeth against the strain, and then the Cybrarian was on the wall beside him, and the fugitives dropped down on the other side. Chapter 5 The Children of Jebel Sag.
Which way is the river?
Balthus was confused.
We don't dare try for the river now,
grunted Conan.
The woods between the village and the river are swarming with warriors. Come on. We'll head in the last direction they'll expect us to go. West.
Looking back as they entered the thick growth, Balthus beheld the wall dotted with black heads as the savages peered over. The Picts were bewildered. They had not gained the wall in time to see the fugitives take cover. They had rushed to the wall, expecting to repel an attack force. They had seen the body of the dead warrior, but no enemy was in sight. Balthus realized that they did not yet know their prisoner had escaped. From other sounds he believed that the warriors, directed by the shrill voice of Zogar Sag, were destroying the wounded serpent with arrows. The monster was out of the shaman's control. A moment later, the quality of the yells was altered. Screeches of rage rose in the night. Conan laughed grimly. He was leading Balthus along a narrow trail that ran west under the black branches, stepping as swiftly and surely as if he had trod a well-lighted thoroughfare. Balthus stumbled after him, guiding himself by feeling the dense wall on either hand.
They'll be after us now. Zogar's discovered you're gone, and he knows my head wasn't in the pile before the altar hut. The dog. If I'd had another spear, I'd have thrown it through him before I stuck the snake. Keep to the trail. They can't track us by torchlight, and there are a score of paths leading from the village. They'll follow those leading to the river first. Throw a cordon of warriors for miles along the bank, expecting us to try and break through. We won't take to the woods until we have to. We can make better time on this trail. Now buckle down to it and run like you never ran before.
They got over their panic. Curse it quick,
panted Balthus, complying with a fresh burst of speed.
They're not afraid of anything very long,
grunted Conan. For a space, nothing was said between them. The fugitives devoted all their attention to covering distance. They were plunging deeper and deeper into the wilderness and getting further away from civilization at every step. But Balthus did not question Conan's wisdom. The Cybrarian presently took time to grunt.
We're far enough away from the village. We'll swing back to the river in a big circle. No other village within miles of Gorwela. All the Picts are gathered in that vicinity. We'll circle wide around them. They can't track us until daylight. They'll pick up our path then. But before dawn, we'll leave the trail and take to the woods.
They plunged on. The yells died out behind them. Balthus's breath was whistling through his teeth. He felt a pain in his side, and running became torture. He blundered against the bushes on each side of the trail. Conan pulled up suddenly, turned and stared back down the dim path. Somewhere the moon was rising, a dim white glow amidst a tangle of branches.
Shall we take to the woods?
Panted Balthus.
Give me your axe,
murmured Conan softly.
Something is close behind us.
Then we'd better leave the trail,
exclaimed Balthus. Conan shook his head and drew the companion into a dense thicket. The moon rose higher, making a dim light in the path.
We can't fight the whole tribe,
whispered Balthus.
No human being could have found our trail so quickly, or followed us so swiftly,
muttered Conan.
Keep silent.
There followed a tense silence in which Balthus felt that his heart could be heard pounding for miles away. Then abruptly, without a sound to announce its coming, a savage head appeared in the dim path. Balthus's heart jumped into his throat. At first glance, he feared to look upon the awful head of the saber-tooth. But the head was smaller, more narrow. It was a leopard which stood there, snarling silently and glaring down the trail. What wind there was blowing towards the hiding men, concealing their scent. The beast lowered its head and snuffed the trail, then moved forward uncertainly. A chill played down Balthus's spine. The brute was undoubtedly trailing them. And it was suspicious. It lifted its head, its eyes glowing like balls of fire, and growled low in its throat. At that instant, Conan hurled the axe. All the weight of arm and shoulder was behind the throw, and the axe was a streak of silver in the dim moon. Almost before he realized what had happened, Balthus saw the leopard rolling on the ground in its death throes, the handle of the axe standing up from its head. The head of the weapon had split its narrow skull. Conan bounded from the bushes, wrenched his axe free, and dragged the limp body in among the trees, concealing it from the casual glance.
"Now let's go, and go fast,"
he grunted, leading the way southward, away from the trail.
"There'll be warriors coming after that cat. As soon as he got his wits back, Zagar sent him after us. The Picts would follow him, but he'd leave them far behind. He'd circle the village until he hit our trail, and then come after us like a streak. They couldn't keep up with him, but they'll have an idea as to our general direction. They'd follow, listening for his cry. Well, they won't hear that, but they'll find the blood on the trail, and look around and find the body in the brush. They'll pick up our spoor there, if they can. Walk with care."
He avoided clinging briars and low-hanging branches effortlessly, gliding between trees without touching the stems and always planting his feet in the places calculated to show the least evidence of his passing. But with Balthus, it was slower, more laborious work. No sound came from behind them. They had covered more than a mile when Balthus said,
"Does Zogar Sag catch leopard cubs and train them for bloodhounds?"
Conan shook his head.
"That was a leopard he called out of the woods."
"But,"
Balthus persisted,
"if he can order the beasts to do his bidding, why doesn't he rouse them all and have them after us? The forest is full of leopards. Why send only one after us?"
Conan did not reply for a space, and when he did, it was with a curious reticence.
"He can't command all the animals. Only such as remember Jabal Sag."
"Jabal Sag?"
Balthus repeated the ancient name hesitantly. He had never heard it spoken more than 3 or 4 times in his whole life.
"Once all living things worshipped him. That was long ago, when beasts and men spoke one language. Men have forgotten him. Even the beasts forget. Only a few remember. The men who remember Jebel Sag and the beasts who remember are brothers and speak the same tongue."
Balthus did not reply. He had strained at a Pictish stake and seen the nighted jungle give up its fanged horrors at a shaman's call.
"Civilized men laugh," said Conan, "but not one can tell me how Zogar Sag can call pythons and tigers and leopards out of the wilderness and make them do his bidding. They would say it's a lie, if they dared. That's the way with civilized men. When they can't explain something by their half-baked science, they refuse to believe it."
The people on the Tauran were closer to the primitive than most Aquilonians. Superstitions persisted, whose sources were lost in antiquity, and Balthus had seen that which still prickled his flesh. He could not refute the monstrous thing which Conan's words implied.
"I've heard there's an ancient grove, sacred to Jebel Sag, somewhere in this forest," said Conan. "I don't know, I've never seen it, but more beasts remember in this country than any I've ever seen."
"Then others will be on our trail?"
"They are now,"
was Conan's disquieting answer.
"Zagar would never leave our tracking to one beast alone."
"What are we to do, then?"
asked Balthus, uneasily, grasping his axe as he stared at the gloomy arches above him. His flesh crawled with the momentary expectation of ripping talons and fangs leaping from the shadows.
"Wait."
Conan turned, squatted, and with his knife began scratching a curious symbol in the mould. Stooping to look at it over his shoulder, Balthus felt a crawling of the flesh along his spine. He knew not why. He felt no wind against his face, but there was a rustling of leaves above them, and a weird moaning swept ghostily through the branches. Conan glanced up, inscrutably, then rose and stood staring somberly down at the symbol he had drawn.
"What is it?"
whispered Balthus. It looked archaic and meaningless to him. He supposed that it was his ignorance of artistry which prevented his identifying it as one of the conventional designs of some prevailing culture. But had he been the most erudite artist in the world, he would have been no nearer the solution.
I saw it carved in the rock of a cave no human had visited for 1,000,000 years, muttered Conan. In the uninhabited mountains beyond the Sea of Vilayet, half a world away from this spot. Later I saw a black witch-finder of Kush scratch it in the sand of a nameless river. He told me part of its meaning. It's sacred to Jebel Sag and the creatures which worship him. Watch.
They drew back among the dense foliage, some yards away, and waited in tense silence. To the east, drums muttered, and somewhere to north and west, other drums answered. Balthus shivered, though he knew long miles of black forest separated him from the grim beaters of those drums, whose dull pulsing was a sinister overture that set the dark stage for bloody drama. Balthus found himself holding his breath. Then, with a slight shaking of leaves, the bushes parted, and a magnificent panther came into view. The moonlight dappling through the leaves shone on its glossy coat, rippling with the play of the great muscles beneath it. With its head low, it glided towards them. It was smelling out their trail. Then it halted, as if frozen, its muzzle almost touching the symbol cut in the mould. For a long space it crouched motionless. It flattened its long body and laid its head on the ground before the mark. And Balthus felt the short hairs stir on his scalp, for the attitude of the great carnivore was one of awe and adoration. Then the panther rose and backed away carefully, belly almost to the ground. With his hindquarters among the bushes, he wheeled as if in sudden panic and was gone like a flash of dappled light. Balthus mopped his brow with a trembling hand and glanced at Conan. The barbarian's eyes were smouldering with fires that never lit the eyes of men bred to the ideas of civilization. In that instant he was all wild, and had forgotten the man at his side. In his burning gaze, Balthus glimpsed and vaguely recognized pristine images and half-embodied memories. Shadows from life's dawn, forgotten and repudiated by sophisticated races, ancient, primeval phantasms unnamed and nameless. Then the deeper fires were masked, and Conan was silently leading the way deeper into the forest.
"We've no more to fear from the beasts," he said after a while, "but we've left a sign for men to read. They won't follow our trail very easily, and until they find that symbol, they won't know for sure we've turned south. Even then, it won't be easy to smell us without the beasts to aid them. But the woods south of the trail will be full of warriors looking for us. If we keep moving after daylight, we'll be sure to run into some of them. As soon as we find a good place, we'll hide and wait until another night to swing back and make the river. We've got to warn Valanis, but it won't help him any if we get ourselves killed."
Warn Valanis?
"Hell, the woods along the river are swarming with Picts. That's why they got us. Zogar's brewing war magic. No mere raid this time. He's done something no Pict has done in my memory. United as many as 15 or 16 clans. His magic did it. They'll follow a wizard further than they will a war chief. You saw the mob in the village, and there were hundreds hiding along the riverbank that you didn't see. More coming from further villages. He'll have at least 3,000 fighting men. I lay in the bushes and heard their talk as they went past. They mean to attack the fort. When, I don't know, but Zogar doesn't dare delay long. He's gathered them and whipped them into a frenzy. If he doesn't lead them into battle quickly, they'll fall to quarreling with one another. They're like blood-mad tigers. I don't know whether they can take the fort or not. Anyway, we've got to get back across the river and give the warning. The settlers on the Velitrium road must either get to the fort or back to Velitrium. While the Picts are besieging the fort, war parties will range the road far to the east, might even cross Thunder River, and raid the thickly settled country behind Velitrium.
As he talked, he was leading the way deeper and deeper into the ancient wilderness. Presently, he grunted with satisfaction. They had reached the spot where the underbrush was more scattered, and an outcropping of stone was visible, wandering off southward. Balthus felt more secure as they followed it. Not even a Pict could trail them over naked rock.
"How did you get away?"
he asked presently. Conan tapped his mail shirt and helmet.
If more borderers would wear harness, there'd be fewer skulls hanging on the altar huts. But most men make noise if they wear armor. They were waiting on each side of the path, without moving, and when a Pict stands motionless, the very beasts of the forest pass him without seeing him. They'd seen us crossing the river and gotten their places. If they'd gone into ambush after we left the bank, I'd have had some hint of it. But they were waiting, and not even a leaf trembled. The devil himself couldn't have suspected anything. The first suspicion I had was when I heard a shaft rasp against a bow as it was pulled back. I dropped and yelled for the men behind me to drop, but they were too slow, taken by surprise like that. Most of them fell at the first volley that raked us from both sides. Some of the arrows crossed the trail and struck Picts on the other side. I heard them howl.
He grinned with vicious satisfaction.
Such of us as were left plunged into the woods and closed with them. When I saw the others were all down or taken, I broke through and outfooted the painted devils through the darkness. They were all around me. I ran and crawled and sneaked, and sometimes I lay on my belly under the bushes while they passed me on all sides. I tried for the shore and found it lined with them, waiting for just such a move. But I'd have cut my way through and taken a chance on swimming, only I heard the drums pounding in the village and knew they'd taken somebody alive. They were all so engrossed in Zogar's magic that I was able to climb the wall behind the altar hut. There was a warrior supposed to be watching at that point, but he was squatting behind the hut and peering around the corner at the ceremony. I came up behind him and broke his neck with my hands before he knew what was happening. It was his spear I threw into the snake, and that's his axe you're carrying.
"But what was that thing you killed in the altar hut?"
asked Balthus, with a shiver at the memory of the dim-seen horror.
One of Zogar's gods, one of Jebel's children that didn't remember and had to be kept chained to the altar. A bull ape. The Picts think they're sacred to the hairy one who lives on the moon, the gorilla god of Golah. It's getting light. Here's a good place to hide until we see how close they are on our trail. Probably have to wait until night to break back to the river.
A low hill pitched upwards, girdled and covered with thick trees and bushes. Near the crest, Conan slid into a tangle of jutting rocks, crowned by dense bushes. Lying among them, they could see the jungle below without being seen. It was a good place to hide or defend. Balthus did not believe that even a Pict could have trailed them over the rocky ground for the past 4 or 5 miles. But he was afraid of the beast that obeyed Zogar's Sag. His faith in the curious symbol wavered a little now. But Conan had dismissed the possibility of beasts tracking them. A ghostly whiteness spread through the dense branches. The patches of sky visible altered in hue, grew from pink to blue. Balthus felt a gnawing of hunger, though he had slaked his thirst at a stream they had skirted. There was complete silence, except for an occasional chirp of a bird. The drums were no longer to be heard. Balthus's thoughts reverted to the grim scene before the altar hut.
"Those were ostrich plumes Zogar Sag wore," he said. "I have seen them on the helmets of knights who rode from the east to visit the barons of the marches. There are no ostriches in this forest, are there?"
They came from Kush,
answered Conan.
West of here, many marches, lies the seashore. Ships from Zingara occasionally come and trade weapons and ornaments and wine to the coastal tribes for skins and copper ore and gold dust. Sometimes they trade ostrich plumes they got from the Stygians, who in turn got them from the black tribes of Kush, which lies south of Stygia. The Pictish shamans place great store by them, but there's much risk in such trade. The Picts are too likely to try and seize the ship, and the coast is dangerous to ships. I've sailed along it when I was with the pirates of the Barakan Isles, which lies southwest of Zingara.
Balthus looked at his companion with admiration.
I knew you hadn't spent your life on this frontier. You mentioned several far places. You've traveled widely.
I've roamed far, farther than any other man of my race ever wandered. I've seen all the great cities of the Hyborians, the Shemites, the Stygians, and the Hyrcanians. I've roamed in the unknown countries south of the black kingdoms of Kush, and east of the Sea of Vilayet. I've been a mercenary captain, a corsair, a Cossack, a penniless vagabond, a general. Hell, I've been everything except a king of a civilized country, and I may be that before I die.
The fancy pleased him, and he grinned heartily. Then he shrugged his shoulders and stretched his mighty figure on the rocks.
This is as good a life as any. I don't know how long I'll stay on the frontier. A week, a month, a year. I have a roving foot, but it's as well on the border as anywhere.
Balthus set himself to watch the forest below them. Momentarily he expected to see fierce painted faces thrust through the leaves. But as the hours passed, no stealthy footfall disturbed the brooding quiet. Balthus believed the Picts had missed their trail and given up the chase. Conan grew restless.
We should have sighted the parties scouring the woods for us. If they've quit the chase, it's because they're after bigger game. They may be gathering to cross the river and storm the fort.
Would they come this far south if they lost the trail?
They've lost the trail, all right. Otherwise, they'd have been on our necks before now. Under ordinary circumstances, they'd scour the woods for miles in every direction. Some of them should have passed without sight of this hill. They must be preparing to cross the river. We've got to take a chance and make for the river.
Creeping down the rocks, Balthus felt his flesh crawl between his shoulders, as he momentarily expected a withering blast of arrows from the green masses above them. He feared that the Picts had discovered them and were lying about in ambush. But Conan was convinced no enemies were near, and the Cybrarian was right.
We're miles to the south of the village,
grunted Conan.
We'll hit straight through for the river. I don't know how far down the river they've spread. We'll hope to hit it below them.
With haste that seemed reckless to Balthus, they hurried eastward. The woods seemed empty of life. Conan believed that all the Picts were gathered in the vicinity of Gwawela. He did not believe they would cross in the daytime, however.
Some woodsman would be sure to see them and give the alarm. They'll cross above and below the fort, out of sight of the sentries. Then others will get in canoes and make straight across for the river wall. As soon as they attack, those hidden in the woods on the east shore will assail the fort from the other sides. They've tried that before, and got the guts shot and hacked out of them. But this time, they've got enough men to make a real onslaught of it.
They pushed on without pausing, though Balthus gazed longingly at the squirrels flitting amongst the branches, which he could have brought down with a cast of his axe. With a sigh, he drew up his broad belt. The everlasting silence and gloom of the primitive forest was beginning to depress him. He found himself thinking of the open groves and sun-dappled meadows of the Toran, of the bluff cheer of his father's steep-thatched, diamond-panelled house, of the fat cows browsing through the deep, lush grass, and the hearty fellowship of the brawny, bare-armed ploughman and herdsman. He felt lonely, in spite of his companion. Conan was as much a part of this wilderness as Balthus was alien to it. The Cybrarian might have spent years among the great cities of the world. He might have walked with the rulers of civilization. He might even achieve his wild whims some day and rule as king of a civilized nation. Stranger things had happened. But he was no less a barbarian. He was concerned only with the naked fundamentals of life. The warm intimacies of small, kindly things, the sentiments and delicious trivialities that make up so much of civilized men's lives were meaningless to him. A wolf was no less a wolf because a whim of chance caused him to run with the watchdogs. Bloodshed and violence and savagery were the natural elements of the life Conan knew. He could not and would never understand the little things that are so dear to civilized men and women. The shadows were lengthening when they reached the river and peered through the masking bushes. They could see up and down the river for about a mile each way. The sullen stream lay bare and empty. Conan scowled across at the other shore.
We've got to take another chance here. We've got to swim the river. We don't know whether they've crossed or not. The woods over there may be alive with them. We've got to risk it. We're about 6 miles south of Gwawela.
He wheeled and ducked as a bowstring twanged. Something like a white flash of light streaked through the bushes. Balthus knew it was an arrow. Then, with a tigerish bound, Conan was through the bushes. Balthus caught the gleam of steel as he whirled his sword, and heard a death scream. The next instant, he had broken through the bushes after the Cybrarian. A Pict with a shattered skull lay face down on the ground, his fingers spasmodically clawing at the grass. Half a dozen others were swarming about Conan, swords and axes lifted. They had cast away their bows, useless at such deadly close quarters. Their lower jaws were painted white, contrasting vividly with their dark faces, and the designs on their muscular breasts differed from any Balthus had ever seen. One of them hurled his axe at Balthus and rushed after it with lifted knife. Balthus ducked and then caught the wrist that drove the knife licking at his throat. They went to the ground together, rolling over and over. The Pict was like a wild beast, his muscles hard as steel strings. Balthus was striving to maintain his hold on the wild man's wrist and bring his own axe into play. But so fast and furious was the struggle that each attempt to strike was blocked. The Pict was wrenching furiously to free his knife hand, was clutching at Balthus's axe and driving his knees into the youth's groin. Suddenly, he attempted to shift his knife to his free hand. And in that instant, Balthus, struggling up on one knee, split the painted head with a desperate blow of his axe. He sprang up and glared wildly about for his companion, expecting to see him overwhelmed by numbers. Then he realized the full strength and ferocity of the Cybrarian. Conan bestrode 2 of his attackers, shorn half asunder by that terrible broadsword. As Balthus looked, he saw the Cybrarian beat down a thrusting short sword, avoid the stroke of an axe with a cat-like sidewise spring which brought him within arm's length of a squat savage stooping for a bow. Before the Pict could straighten, the red sword flailed down and clove him from shoulder to mid-breastbone, where the blade stuck. The remaining warriors rushed in, one from either side. Balthus hurled his axe with an accuracy that reduced the attackers to 1, and Conan, abandoning his efforts to free his sword, wheeled and met the remaining Pict with his bare hands. The stocky warrior, a head shorter than his tall enemy, leapt in, striking with his axe, at the same time stabbing murderously with his knife. The knife broke on the Cybrarian's mail, and the axe checked in midair as Conan's fingers locked like iron on the descending arm. The bone snapped loudly, and Balthus saw the Pict wince and falter. The next instant he was swept off his feet, lifted high above the Cybrarian's head. He writhed in midair for an instant, kicking and thrashing, and then was dashed headlong to the earth with such force that he rebounded and then lay still, his limp posture telling of splintered limbs and a broken spine.
Come on!
Conan wrenched his sword free and snatched up an axe.
Grab a bow and a handful of arrows, and hurry! We've got to trust to our heels again. And that yell was heard. They'll be here in no time. If we tried to swim now, they'd feather us with arrows before we reached midstream.
Thank you for listening. For updates, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Images courtesy of Unsplash.com. Audio courtesy of YouTube Audio Library. Artists credited in the description. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.